I'm Venetia Rainey.
And I'm Arthur Scott Geddes.
And this is Battle Lines Global Health Security. It's Wednesday, 18th of February, 2026.
2 years ago, Alexei Navalny, the Russian opposition leader, died in a Siberian prison cell. There was a public outcry at the time, and many suspected foul play, but nothing could be proved. That is, until last weekend, 5 European countries, including the UK, announced they had made a startling discovery. Navalny had been killed with a rare frog poison.
So how did Russia do it? How did we find out that they'd done it? And what does this mean for what we know about Russia's store of chemical weapons? To discuss all of this, we're joined by Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, a former commanding officer at the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Regiment, and Dr. Gemma Bowsher from the Centre of Conflict and Health Research at King's College London. Hamish and Gemma, welcome to Battle Lines Global Health Security.
Gemma, can you tell us what this frog poison actually is? How does it work?
This frog poison, ipibutadine, it was identified in the 1970s through chemical investigations looking at frogs in the Ecuadorian jungles, essentially. But as in all kind of medical discovery, when this was identified as an effective painkiller, it was identified that what was particularly effective about this was that it disrupted the communication between cells in the central nervous system. So it's a painkiller. It's really, really effective as a painkiller, far more effective than something such as morphine. The problem with it is that the very narrow range that it is effective as a painkiller sits very, very close to the much wider range where it's lethal in dosage. And so it was essentially shelved as a potential prospect for widespread use as a painkiller, which could have potentially replaced morphine and other things. That being said, of course, when toxic compounds such as this are identified, it then opens up the opportunities for malign actors to further develop their chemical weapons development programs and then use these compounds that they can synthesize in their own laboratories for use for malign instances. And that appears to be what's happened here.
Do we know how many countries might have stores of this compound or have done research into this type of toxic element?
It's important to remember that a compound like this, as opposed to other types of what we can call maybe the nefarious compounds that have medicinal properties, and it's actually a relatively simple chemical structure. So simply having this compound in a laboratory isn't necessarily in and of itself a sign of malign use. It might be used for research purposes on the central nervous system, for example. We know that there are offenders in the chemical weapons space, and so no one should be surprised when countries such as Russia then turn out to have these. And in fact, organisations within Russia that are suspected to be developing chemical weapons have published work on this compound ipibutadine, which is, again, a fairly unexpected and sort of smoking gun for this sort of work. There are lots of countries that we know develop chemical weapons, but equally the basic properties of this are medicinal. So we might find related chemicals in plenty of countries' laboratory systems, and that potentially could be used by actors such as Russia as a target in the information space to try and claim that they're not the only ones who have these sorts of stocks.
So how did Russia get together enough of this compound for it to be useful for this purpose? They're not going into the jungle to collect these frogs, are they?
No, absolutely not. And the poison dart frog narrative, of course, it grabs headlines. It sounds outlandish. Of course, it is outlandish in origin, but actually the kind of concept that compounds from nature are used in medicines and potentially for malign use later is not so outlandish. That's quite common. What Russia has done here, as many medicinal chemists do, is take a naturally occurring compound in the environment, use laboratory techniques, so almost certainly chromatographic techniques, which in a laboratory essentially means, I like to think of it kind of like Lego blocks, right? If you look at a complex structure made out of Lego, you could take the pieces of Lego apart, work out what it is, and then you could go to a separate box of Lego and build the same structure yourself, synthesize it yourself using your own parts, right? And that's what's happened in a laboratory in Russia. But I think also it's important to say that a compound such as this, you probably don't need to have in really large stocks, unlike what they're using on the battlefields in Ukraine, for example, where they will need sort of industrial level facilities to produce large amounts. This, if you're delivering it in a highly directed way, you probably can keep in much smaller quantities within discrete research laboratories.
Well, Hamish, I know this is your speciality subject, and we'll come on to more sort of what's being used on the Ukrainian battlefield later. But just on this particular case, can you talk us through how the UK and these 4 other European countries managed to prove that this poison had been used? How did we get a sample of Navalny out of Russia? And talk us through some of the work that the scientists at Porton Down did to sort of come to this conclusion.
Well, I think first of all, none of us are surprised that Navalny was actually murdered by the Russian state. And as Gemma's described these various toxins, this is straight out of the Russian Security Secret Service handbook. They like to kill people like Navalny with exotic toxins or things like polonium-210 isotopes. For a number of reasons, I think, it's, first of all, they want to give a message they can kill anybody they want anywhere in the world. And secondly, by using these exotic toxins, it's also sort of trying to flex their muscles. But I think the counter to that is exactly your question. How do we actually know this? How do we get these samples? And I think it shows a number of things. I expect Putin probably wants us to know this. But having said that, the relative ease that we've got hold of these samples, it's a bit like the relative ease we tracked down the agents who delivered the Novichok to Sergei Skripal in Salisbury, where I'm talking to you from. So the Russian Secret Service is a little bit inept. Now, how these samples have come out, it's clear that there are people who have opposed the state in Russia. There are people close to Navalny, and I think it also probably underlines the expertise of our own security service to get this. And the actual analysis, Gemma's probably far more qualified to speak than I am. But as she said, once you have a decent sample, and with all my experience of collecting samples in Syria, it's so very important that the samples are collected and prepared properly so that they are admissible. And we don't know the full extent of that. But the fact that Yvette Cooper, the Foreign Secretary, has been so demonstrative in what she said, that there is no good reason that this toxin could be in Navalny. The only way it could happen would be through some sort of state activity. But I think you'd need a relatively small sample of human tissue. And Porton Down is a designated Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons laboratory, certified, and has the expertise to be able to work out exactly these sort of things. And I think also a lab in Sweden and somewhere else, another designated OPCW lab, has confirmed this. So I think we are pretty certain what the government is saying is absolutely true. But again, these things leave a marker, and the marker points absolutely directly to the Kremlin.
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because it's just like Russia leaving its fingerprints all over. And as you mentioned, it's just like with Novichok. It's so unusual that it is as if they are trying to send some sort of signal. And I wonder if you could just talk a bit more about what signal you think Russia is trying to send there, Hamish.
I think the most important thing that one needs to realise is that this is how Russia does its business, and the signal it's trying to show. We're talking about an autocratic dictatorship here. Putin has only stayed in power for 25, 26 years by being absolutely ruthless, and anybody who opposes him, of course, we look back to 2006, Litvinenko, another opposition leader, murdered with polonium-210. Polonium-210, we talk for hours about, you could probably buy it on the dark web, but it's going to cost you millions of dollars a drop. Therefore, again, it points so clearly at the Russians. Then Skripal, a double agent, in the way that the spy world works. If you're exposed as a double agent, you're supposed to retire and stop doing stuff. The Russians seem to think that he wasn't doing that, so that they were going to take him out. And there are a whole host of other cases as well of people who have opposed Russia, who have fallen off balconies, mysteriously died. That is the message the Russians are trying to show. And that is the way that these sort of autocratic dictators stay in position, that they've got the reach, they can reach in and do things. And I think the head of MI6 and others recently have said, we're in this sort of grey zone. We are in a hybrid war with Russia. And these are the sort of activities that they do. And I'm sure people get terribly terrified by it, but I think this Navalny case and the fact we know so much about it should reassure people that actually, quite apart from the Russians doing all this sort of espionage and this sort of activity, there are an awful lot of people in the West trying to counter it and actually doing a pretty good job as well.
So at the same time, as Russia's obviously, I think, trying to send a message, the poison that they've used, I think, can be very difficult to detect in the body and wouldn't be detected by a normal kind of autopsy screening. How would you go about looking for signs of this poisoning, Gemma?
This is a challenge, right? And this is where we get into the kind of forensic side beyond the medical side, because it's a heroic tale, really, of this smuggling of samples from Russia. It's quite an impressive story, and look, when you're trying to identify samples, as you say quite rightly, this is not going to come up in a standard panel, your normal drugs, that you're going to screen for alcohol, etc. So firstly, there's going to have to be decisions about what samples are taken. And that's really important, because when it comes to subsequent investigations, you also need to be able to prove that you've had some kind of custody over that sample too. So in this scenario, the best kind of sample would be blood, but equally, that there are challenges depending on when the individuals that had access to the body were able to take it. There's a question over how the condition of post-mortem blood is kind of a gruesome conversation for today. But so there are other samples that could be taken. For example, liver samples might be one option for exposures that may take, I think, over more time. Hair samples, I think that's probably not the case in this scenario. And that would then need to be smuggled, obviously, out of the country and taken to a laboratory. And that's why, there are many reasons why, particularly the designation of the lab at Porton Down as an OPCW lab, but also the fact that there are very few laboratories in the world that are capable of testing those biological samples against the known prohibited, secret, covert agents that are not in the public sphere, essentially. So we can all presume that it would have been also tested against Novichok agents. That would be a reasonable presumption here. Those kinds of laboratories also have the ability to test for microsamples, all right, so using specialist equipment, specialist techniques. In fact, it seems that the laboratory, again, that I mentioned earlier, that is suspected of having a significant role in Russian chemical programs, had published a paper, had published research on the detection of micro quantities of this compound a few years ago. So it's possible, it's out there in the literature, and there's no reason, if it's out in the public literature, our laboratories in Porton Down and in other settings, maybe in Sweden or elsewhere, that are OPCW designated, certainly will have those capabilities.
Just finally on this case, Yulia Navalny must feel so vindicated, because she has said right from the off, this is foul play, my husband was poisoned. And as you mentioned, Hamish, a lot of people won't be surprised we suspected it. But also, as Gemma says, a heroic effort to actually prove it. What did you make, Hamish, of the announcement over the weekend at Munich Security Conference when Yulia was able to stand alongside Yvette Cooper, the British Foreign Minister, and others to finally announce this finding?
Well, I think it slightly took us all by surprise. Going back to Gemma's description about the samples and how they're analysed, the chain of evidence is absolutely key. We don't know when this analysis was done. Now, I think the timing of the announcement was probably the most important thing here. You've got all the sort of world leaders on the West in one place and trying to garner support for Ukraine, just demonstrating, what a terror state that Russia is. So I think it was, a great thing that actually she has been vindicated from everything else that the rest of us had been talking about and assuming and leaving in no doubt. If this is the sort of thing that we're up against, this is the thing that they're prepared to do. And from a chemical weapons side, I saw a lot of it in Syria as well, and we have the same issues of trying to get samples out. And it is another war crime. This is, in effect, a war crime. We've got the evidence now, presumably go to the International Criminal Court, and at some stage, hopefully, those responsible will have their day in court. But yeah, I think it really was a big moment, and let's hope it galvanizes people to make sure that we can get a just peace as quickly as possible in Ukraine.
So what does this tell us about the state of chemical weapons research in Russia? Is this use of this new poison evidence that they're continuing to develop new weapons, or is that too strong?
I don't think so at all. I have written often and spoke about the Russian chemical weapons program. You go back to November 2017, when the Kremlin declared to the world that they had no chemical weapons left. They destroyed them all, and they harangued America for still having some chemical weapons. A few months later, my hometown, Novichok, spread on the door of Sergei Skripal's house, and then ultimately Dawn Sturgis dying of a Novichok poisoning. So that was a pretty clear indicator, I think, that they would developed it. And from my time in Syria, the Russians, although I don't think they had their hands on the nerve agents used by Assad or the chlorine, but they certainly saw it all happening. And all the modus operandi the Syrians were using was straight out of the Russian handbook. You then wind forward to Ukraine, and over the last 24 months, we've seen industrial amounts of chemical weapons used, ostensibly something called chlorpyrifos, which people will know as sort of CS gas, but it was the first chemical weapon ever used in the First World War. And it is designated as one, and it reacts, it has an effect of a chemical weapon. Now, to produce, the Ukrainians have detailed 9,500 uses. And I speak to brigades quite often. And, a few months ago, I spoke to one brigade in the Donbass, and they've been hit 5 times that day with chlorpyrifos. I mean, it is, it's not sort of headline news because, it's right control agent, but it's having the same effect. But your question on the chemical weapons program, I think the Navalny thing just hopefully underwrites to people what the Russian state is capable of. Now, chemical weapons, I've said, and I wrote in my own memoir that, if you have no morals or scruples, you'd use chemical weapons all the time because they're so effective. I was in Aleppo in December 2016, and that had been under conventional siege for 4 years. But 17 days of Syrians dropping chlorine barrel bombs broke that siege, and it was phenomenal. And I saw an exercise when I came back on Salisbury Plain of a British battle group trying to attack a village on Salisbury Plain, simulated using conventional means. And it's the way the exercise unfolded. It sort of happened in about half an hour. And I said to the generals there, the only way you're going to take this village in half an hour is to use chemical weapons. But of course, they are beyond the pale. So I think, when you put yourself in the Kremlin where you have no limits, something like chemical weapons, which are, I describe them as a poor person's nuclear weapons. They're very, very easy and fairly cheap to make, but hugely effective. And the final bit on this, I go back to the Obama Red Line in Syria in September 2012. And again, I was in Syria at the time, and I was in Syria a year later when the massive attack was happening on Ghouta in Damascus that killed 1,500 people. Actually, I was there a few months ago seeing the ground site, and nothing demonstrative was done, and therefore I think that sort of gave to Putin and the Russians, well, we can probably get away with using this stuff where we probably can't get away with a tactical nuclear weapon, which I'm sure they would be desperately keen to use in Ukraine if they thought they could get away with it.
Gemma, do you want to come in on that? I remember reading about poison factories in Russia, these sort of shady labs with nondescript addresses where they're researching things like frog poison, which I won't attempt to pronounce, and Novichok and all of that sort of thing. What do you think this latest incident tells us about the state of chemical weapons research in Russia?
It tells us that they're still doing it, but I think that epibactidine, it's one of those more what I describe as the sort of boutique agents, right? In contrast to the chlorpyrifos that are being used on the battlefield. I mean, I spend a lot of time in Ukraine, and although targeted assassination in Ukraine is clearly a concern, the Russians have also shown perfect willingness to gun politicians down in the streets. For example, in Lviv last summer, I was in Lviv at the time that they did it. That was a revolver. So nothing too exciting there. In Ukraine, they're particularly focused on using these agents for clearing battlefields. But in terms of the state of the research, I think we have to presume the Russians will always use their scientific apparatus to do what they can to develop new agents. They like to assassinate people, and they like to assassinate people in ways that show that they can assassinate people in interesting ways, in ways that, are gruesome, grab headlines. Why kill someone with polonium? It sends a very clear message that we will harm you, and we will harm you in a particularly nasty way. And that's what they did here. So although I sort of started by saying, in some ways epibactidine isn't a particularly exciting compound chemically, it sends that message that, yes, we will kill you in what I've described as this boutique way, in this kind of bespoke, targeted way, and you cannot escape us. And these facilities, it's not just the facilities and the laboratories themselves, it's also a large supply chain that supplies the agents, the precursors, the compounds. These are huge infrastructures, actually. And that, that's where if I was advising people, would also suggest that the targets go in terms of intervening in the wider war machine to try and counter some of these programs in Russia.
Can one of you give us a sense of the state of Russia's chemical weapons program? What else do we know that they have? We've got these sort of boutique agents that grab headlines, as you say, but probably are not very widely used. We've got riot control agents, which they're using quite widely on the battlefield in Ukraine. What else do we know that they have?
Well, I think what you've described there is a great range. As Gemma's articulated, you've got the boutique agents for the assassinations, and if you shoot somebody, then you're not going to get headline news. But if you kill them with a frog poison, it's all over the papers, for days. And that's exactly what Russia wants. And then you've got the chloropicrine, which, the Russians are, of course, saying, this is just used riot control agents all the time in Europe. What's the problem? But actually, to me, it's really clever, because using chloropicrine on the trenches is exactly the same as using a nerve agent, sarin or Novichok. It has the same effect. It gets people out of the trenches, and then they're sort of shot conventionally. Now, whether Russia has got anything in between, it's pretty clear that they are still working on Novichok, which is a sort of range of nerve agents. Quite boutique, and the Novichok that was used to poison Sergei Skripal was designed so that NATO sensors couldn't pick it up. It was designed to be very persistent, so we couldn't. Took 18 months to clean up Salisbury for a quarter of an egg cup of Novichok. So that is a hell of a bang for your buck. Whether Russia's perhaps I know from people in Ukraine, the dread is that they will produce or use something more toxic than chloropicrine. God forbid if they use Novichok in any quantity, that could be devastating. But whether they have done that is unlikely. The main place a place called Shikany, which was the sort of massive Russian port and down 200 kilometers from Moscow, is where they used to produce chemical weapons in large scale. That mysteriously was bulldozed to the ground shortly after Skripal was the Skripal attack, and then they've divulged or moved to these other places which are not quite so don't seem to have the capacity. So we don't know. I think we assume that they have an active program. They're developing it. The standard operating procedures they're using on the front line is straight out of the handbook that they have. It's straight out of the handbook from the First World War, to be perfectly frank. But it's so simple and effective. It goes back to my comment on how effective these weapons are. So I think we assume, and I know I recently visited the British Army's Land Warfare Centre exploitations team in Warminster, where they look at all the lessons and see how we can adapt. And everybody talks about drones all the time, but that is just another element of the battlefield. But what they've also identified is going forward, our soldiers in NATO need to be able to operate in this contaminated environment, because the Russians are using it and developing it, and it's having such a marginal advantage. So I think this is something that we need to concern ourselves with. And I think certainly from lessons learned in the British military, they are very much aware of it. But all the, dare I say it, all the glamour and the money at the moment is pointing towards drones. But, if you can't fight in a contaminated environment to start with, the fact that drones are also dropping this stuff and attacking you is a sort of a secondary issue that you've got to cover as well.
Gemma, I just want to follow on for something you were saying earlier. We've done a lot of reporting on global health about the concerns people have about artificial intelligence being used to help design new chemical and biological warfare agents, and also possibly to give different groups the ability to create these things. One of your colleagues is actually the co-author on a paper a few years ago in which they did an extraordinary experiment. It took them 6 hours and they generated 40,000 molecules, including VX gas. What's your sense of whether Russia is interested in this kind of thing? Is this something we should be concerned about?
Absolutely. I think the work you're referring to from my colleague Philippa Lensos really sort of helped kind of raise the awareness over the risks around AI. And of course, as with any dual-use technology, there's the promise and the peril. So the promise is that these kinds of technologies will allow us to identify promising compounds for drug discovery, cancer treatments, treatment against infections, etc., etc. Of course, when you have that ability in AI, using AI to identify compounds that are particularly harmful, particularly potent of the VX type, of the Novichok types, that gives the opportunity to turbo speed the kind of research that you would do through traditional techniques in laboratories. And that is the concern. That's the concern, particularly in the biological weapons space, actually. This is where this conversation has been really alive, and of course also in the chemical weapons space. I think perhaps the attention has been less on this in chemical weapons space than in bio, not because it's less relevant or less of a prospect, but simply because there are plenty of chemical weapons being used today already. Right? So we're not talking about the future, whereas, to the best of our knowledge at the moment, biological weapons, touch wood, are not being used on the battlefields or for targeted assassinations. So it certainly is a major concern, and a lot of work is being done at various levels, not just the conventions, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, but also in the sort of the health organisations, the World Health Organization, which obviously has a special interest in research being done properly for drugs that serve us as humanity, not simply imperil us.
You mentioned the conventions there. Hamish, what can actually be done when a country doesn't comply with these conventions? I mean, what tools do we actually have available to sanction Russia over this?
Well, they're in the challenge, absolutely. And I think, picking up on a point of Gemma's, one of the things about chemical weapons is there are so much toxic industrial chemicals like chlorine, like ammonia, available that you can buy off the shelf that simulate a much worse chemical weapon that actually, because psychology is so important in warfare, and particularly in this sort of warfare, that's the problem. But when it comes back to what you can do, the Chemical Weapons Convention, which most countries in the world have signed, including Russia, and the Organisation of the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, have actually done a pretty good job, since its inception 30 or so years ago, and removed, 95+% of chemical weapons off the world. Sadly, on the biological side, I think we're in a much more challenging space, because the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, again, is a convention, is signed, and we shouldn't be doing this sort of stuff. But unfortunately, there's very little funding for it, and there is not a police force like the OPCW. But to get people to comply, I was very struck once in one of my trips to Syria, and it was a time when it was after the Obama Red Line, and we did nothing, and there were only very few of us who managed to operate in Syria, and a lot of the Syrians are saying, Hamish, why are you lot not doing anything? Why aren't you helping us when Assad is, murdering all our people and attacking our hospitals? And it was really difficult. But what I did say is we'll collect evidence, because at some stage, people will get their comeuppance. I fought in the Bosnian wars, and most of the generals who committed atrocities there, are either dead or in The Hague. So there is the possibility. It does seem remote at the time, and particularly with Russia. What are we doing about Navalny being murdered by this chemical? Very little, except we now have evidence, so that at some stage, to add to the war crimes that Putin has already been indicted for, this will go there. So I think it's very difficult, but we just must be forthright and do what we can, and eventually people will get their comeuppance. But it's not a perfect world. I mean, that unfortunately is the case, and there are many other things vexing people at the moment, and it's just making sure that this stays in the spotlight, and eventually we hold people to account as we should do.
A final question, if I may. Hamish, you've had a lot of experience dealing in this field, from Syria to Salisbury. Do you think that the taboo around the use of these weapons is actually being eroded?
I think on the face of it, you've got to agree that it has. We always used to talk about the taboo after the First World War. I mean, after the First World War, chemical weapons weren't used for a long time. Even Hitler decided not to use them in the Second World War, despite the fact he spent years and no doubt huge resources developing nerve agents like sarin, but he never used them. And it wasn't really until we came to the Halabja attack in 1988 when Saddam Hussein killed thousands of Kurds in the town called Halabja, and then the Iran-Iraq war that it started to use again. But again, that was it wasn't headline news. It was sort of fairly small stuff. But I think the Obama red line really blew the taboo completely to smithereens, and from there, people are seeing that they can get away with it. Whereas perhaps they can't Putin certainly couldn't get away, I don't think, by using a nuclear weapon. So it is a concern, and that taboo needs to be tried to be replaced, because these are horrific weapons. They're very, toxic industrial chemicals. You can buy, I think, 260 tons of this stuff in the UK without even a license. Now, I'd hope if somebody sold you that, they might ring up the local police and say, this is a bit odd. But yeah, I think the taboo's gone, and we need to do all we can to replace them, because, the First World War, the devastation of the First World War is still synonymous with the use of chemical weapons, and we shouldn't forget that.
I echo what Hamish has said on this, and I think we need to be mindful that we have to keep working with the conventions. They are our instruments for maintaining these safeguards, but that where we've also mentioned this hybrid aspect of current warfare, we can also expect the information aspects of warfare to be significantly amped up by the Russians in the coming weeks on this. And it's not just the use of chemical weapons or any other weapon such as this that erodes the integrity of the convention. It's also the making a mockery of it by malign actors, by those who further preposterous narratives. And we've seen this repeatedly in the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention by Russian delegations. We see this repeatedly at the OPCW, at the Chemical Weapons Convention by Russian delegations as well, and others. That it's worth saying it is and others. And I think for me, that was one of the reasons why this dart frog poison was put out, this narrative, because in some ways it's unhelpful. To put out this kind of outlandish concept, because it's not actually from a poisoned dart frog, right? But in something we've seen the Russians come out with preposterous narratives. No one wants to be actually having an argument about poisoned dart frogs at the Chemical Weapons Convention, right? But I think we have to be prepared to deal with the convention at the level of the technical, the investigatory, which we've done, and I think the UK should be commended for the work that it's done and its scientists at Porton Down. And now we have to step up on the information front and say we will counter this at every possible turn. You cannot keep coming at the convention with lies and preposterous claims about what everyone else is doing, because you're doing it yourself.
Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, former commanding officer of the UK's Joint Chemical, Biological, Radiological and Nuclear Regiment, and Dr. Gemma Bowsher, Senior Research Associate for the Centre of Conflict and Health Research at King's College London. Thank you very much for joining us on Battle Lines. I believe you've got a personal experience that's relevant to this conversation, right?
Well, I was talking to my grandmother the other day, and she revealed that her dad, my great-grandfather, actually survived being gassed in the Somme.
No way.
Yeah.
Wow.
Chlorine gas. And I think he was quite sick afterwards.
Yeah, I was going to say, there must be some long-lasting effects from that.
Yeah.
Awful. Well, I thought it was a really interesting discussion, and always good to also have that sort of check on. I mean, look, we work in a news organisation, and do people here get very excited when they hear Ecuadorian dart frog poison? They do.
Yeah.
They do.
Yeah.
But I thought that was a good sort of broad-ranging discussion about the reality of Russia's chemical weapons
And it's
program.
interesting, isn't it, to think about how those details and these kind of newspaper headlines that we make might further Russia's narrative in some way.
Yeah, that is quite a sobering thought.
Yeah.
But I think also chatting to, both Hamish and Gemma actually about the sort of mass use of chemical weapons that Russia is engaging with on the Ukrainian battlefield. I think that's a really important point to draw out of this, because, as you say, this is headline-grabbing stuff, and I think we all kind of knew that Navalny was killed by Russia one way or another. So, okay, the details are obviously interesting, but Russia uses chemical weapons. I think that's the important point to draw out of all of this.
Yep, exactly. That's all for today's episode. We'll be back on Friday. Goodbye.
Goodbye.